So for the purpose of our video today, what we'll be examining is what some might call the quintessential question of philosophy, and that is, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life? Does life have a meaning? Does it have purpose? Does it have value? What do we mean when we say, when we talk about the meaning of life? All of these questions are things that we're going to be examining. And we're going to get started off by asking a few questions about the question. In other words, we'll be questioning the question of the meaning of life. For example, this particular question we see at first glance is what we might call an axiological question. Axiology, if you'll recall from the very first couple of sessions of our class together, axiology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the study of value. And typically what we find is the field of ethics and aesthetics fall into this category. But this question is necessarily an axiological question. It's asking about the value of life or the meaning of life. What does life mean? Does it have any meaning, and that sort of thing? Does life have value? If it does have value, then who or what determines the value of your life? Who or what determines the value of your life? Who's the one who gets to say whether or not life has value, whether or not life has meaning? And what do we mean when we even say the meaning of life? You know, when we hear that question, what is the meaning of life? What kind of question is that anyway? Well, there are two different ways in which we might approach an answer to this question. If we say, what do we mean when we say the meaning of life? One fundamental categorical distinction between concepts of meaning is that of objective meaning and subjective meaning. Just like in ethics, when we talk about having objective ethics and subjective ethics, so also in the realm of meaning of life, in reference to that question, there is an objective way that we can answer that, or a subjective way. For example, objective meaning is meaning and purpose that we have by the fact that we're human beings. It's meaning that we have by our very nature. It doesn't matter what we choose. It doesn't matter what we think, what we become later on, what we make of ourselves, what sort of goals or dreams or aspirations we have. If the question of the meaning of life is determined on objective standards, it's referring to meaning that is outside of our own personal mind. Some examples of this, and different examples of different thinkers who have given this throughout history, could be that, for example, Aristotle says that the meaning of a person's life, or the purpose, the telos, the ultimate goal of a person's life, is that of happiness. And by happiness, if you'll recall, when we talked about virtue ethics, what Aristotle was talking about there was the good life, eudaimonia. It's happiness, the good life. Everybody pursues that in one way or another. They may pursue it different ways, but they're all shooting for the same goal. And so that's the meaning of human life. Others might say something like reason is the meaning for human life, because reason is what sets humans apart from other animals. Therefore, pursuing reason and the exercise of reason should be the goal or the end, the meaning of human life. Others might say our duty or our obligation toward others, or toward those who demand our loyalty and that sort of thing. That would be the meaning of life. But again, all of those things are outside of us. Some might say the glory of God is the meaning that we have for life. That's what we should be living to pursue. And all of those things exist outside of ourselves. And all of those things seek to define the meaning of life based on something outside of ourselves and something that we all have in common. For example, if it's happiness that we're pursuing, what would normally be said is that we're all pursuing happiness. I am, you are, your neighbor is, and so forth. So we are all pursuing happiness, eudaimonia, the end goal, or we're all pursuing our duty, or we're all pursuing the glory of God. In other words, this is a meaning that is one sort of a one-size-fits-all. It's the ultimate goal for what our lives should be aiming toward. That's objective meaning. And every human being has the same objective meaning if objective meaning exists. Now, then there's subjective meaning. And subjective meaning is usually what people think of when they hear this question, at least nowadays they do. It's usually what people, sort of default to. But subjective meaning is meaning and purpose that individuals choose for themselves. Meaning and purpose that individuals choose for themselves. This could be personal goals, it could be hopes and dreams, that kind of thing, aspirations, things that we're striving toward. These are things that give meaning to my life. So, for example, I have 6 children, and my wife and I chose to have 6 children because having those children gave great meaning to our life. It was something that we found joy in. We loved kids. We still do love them. Most of them, no, I'm just kidding. We still do love them, but that's why we chose to do that. That was our own choice. Now, some might say, well, the point of the human race is the propagation of the race. Well, that's not what we were thinking of when we decided to have those kids. But if that is the case, if that's actually the case, then that would be objective meaning. And what that would mean is that every human being, to the extent that they are able, it is incumbent upon them to have children. Well, if in fact that is a shared meaning for each individual, the propagation of the race. So anyway, that's the difference. That's a significant difference that we're going to be looking at, the difference between objective meaning and subjective. Objective means that our meaning is assigned to us from something outside of ourselves. Subjective meaning means that is meaning that is chosen by ourselves. It's more personal and perspectival, if you will. So those are that is a very significant categorical distinction between what people mean when they say, is there meaning to life? So we'll be looking at 3 different views today that interact with the question of objective meaning and subjective meaning. And these 3 views are going to answer 2 different questions differently. So here are the 2 questions that each one of these views is going to answer that might help us understand the distinction between them. The first question is this: does objective meaning exist? Does objective meaning exist? And the second question is, must meaning be objective in order to be real? In other words, if we're looking for meaning, does it have to be objective meaning? Or could we just simply do with subjective meaning? So those are the 2 questions. Does objective meaning exist? Yes or no? And must meaning be objective in order to be real? Yes or no? Those are the 2 questions. The first view that we'll look at is called the nihilist view. And the nihilist view says, it answers these questions. And it says, to the question, does objective meaning exist? It says, no, objective meaning does not exist. And to the question of, must meaning be objective in order to be real? It's going to say, yes, it does need to be real. So the nihilist view, you can see automatically, is going to answer the question of there's no meaning to life, because meaning has to be objective and objective meaning doesn't exist. So there is no meaning to life. The next view that we'll be looking at is known as the existentialist view, or as I will be calling it, the secular humanist view. Now, the secular humanist view answers the question of the existence of objective meaning. It says, no, objective meaning does not exist. Just like the nihilist, it agrees that objective meaning does not exist. However, when it comes to the question of whether or not meaning has to be objective in order to be real, the secular humanist view says, no, it doesn't actually need to be objective meaning in order to be real. People can find meaning in subjective meaning, and that's okay. There doesn't need to be any overarching meaning that applies to everybody. And the third view that we're going to look at is known as the religious view. And the religious view answers the question, does objective meaning exist? It says, yes, it does. Objective meaning exists, and the author or the source of that objective meaning, most often in the religious view, comes from God. The second question, must meaning be objective to be real? The religious answer would again answer, yes, it does need to be real. So here, the religious view agrees also with the nihilist when it says that objective meaning must exist in order for meaning to be real. It's just that the religious view believes that objective meaning does exist. Now that we've seen a summary of how these views might address the issue of objective and subjective meaning, we'll take a little bit more of a closer look at each one of them individually. The first view that we're going to be looking at is known as nihilism. Nihilism comes from the Latin word that means nothing. And as it relates to the view or the question of the meaning of life, nihilists believe that life has no meaning. It's ultimately meaningless. Life is meaningless because the universe that we live in is basically a big purposeless machine. There's no reason for it. There's no rhyme. There's no specified order by any higher intelligence. The universe just happens to be there, and it's basically a not even a bio, but it's basically a chemical machine, a machine of energy, a machine that works according to the laws of physics that describe it, but there really is no ultimate end in mind. It just is. It's purposeless. There's no telos. There's no ultimate goal. Human beings form a very small and virtually insignificant part of this machine. Human beings exist on one planet among billions that could be trillions that could be present in the universe. We are just one species of animal on one planet in the entire universe. We are dwarfed by this enormous machine, and we're just part of it. We're cogs in the machine. We're just part of the chemical reaction that takes place on this in this machine. And our lives have no purpose whatsoever. There's nothing to make them purposeful. There's no ultimate goal. There's nothing. We're just a part of the machine. We have no ultimate purpose. And you know what? After we're gone, nobody's going to remember us. Nobody will know. Nobody will care. And the universe will just continue to move on and do what it does in the absence of human life. So really, there's no meaning whatsoever to life. That's the nihilist view. Now, this is a very simple view to explain. It also is a very simple view to understand. The problem comes in, however, that this view is virtually impossible to live or to sustain philosophically. And here's why. People can claim a philosophical position of nihilism. They can talk about life having no meaning and all this sort of thing. But at the end of the day, by their actions, people betray the fact that they do, in fact, believe that something is meaningful. This view is basically unlivable. You cannot live consistently with it, because the nihilist ultimately is going to find value in communicating his ideas. He's going to talk about his ideas to other people, and he's going to explain it, and he's going to try to persuade people to believe like he does. And why? Why bother? If life has no meaning at the end of the day, who cares what people believe? Who cares about spreading my nihilism to other people? Misery loves company. Well, then I suppose you find value in company. Therefore, there is some sort of value, right? The nihilist finds value in continuing to live. The nihilist finds value in continuing to live. The nihilist who has not yet committed suicide is a nihilist who is being inconsistent with his view. Now, I am not in any way, shape, or form advocating that anybody commit suicide. That would be a horrible thing to do. Why is that? Well, because there is value in life. And the nihilist shows that every time he takes a bite of his sandwich, that he is somehow, some way, some shape, finding value, even if it's a very small value to life. It may be a subjective value, which we'll see about that in just a moment. But the nihilist doesn't actually live consistently with his worldview, because he talks to others. He tries to persuade them of his ideas. He continues to live. Basically, the nihilist, in doing these things, shows himself to be nothing more than a depressed secular humanist, or maybe we might say a pessimistic secular humanist, a secular humanist who doesn't get a lot of joy out of life, but still, nevertheless, finds meaning in life, because there's no way to live consistently with nihilism. So that is one of the views that are sort of sometimes entertained by a mental exercise. It just isn't one that's very easy to live. It's one that actually is impossible to live. The next view that we're going to look at is that of secular humanism. Secular humanism. Now, your book will talk about this as being sort of an existentialist view, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But there are existentialists who are religious existentialists as well, who would fit better into the latter category. So this view is probably better discussed as secular humanism. Now, secular humanism says that individuals must create their own meaning to life. Individuals must create their own meaning to life. Now, let me explain a little bit of something about the term secular humanism. It may not be a term that you're very familiar with, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page when I'm using it. The word secular comes from the Latin term secularum, which means world. Basically, it talks about the universe or the world. And so when we're talking about the secular things, we're talking about things of this world. Secular has come to be sort of spoken of in contradiction or in contradistinction to things of a religious nature. So when we say that something is secular, we're talking about worldly things, not heavenly things. When we say that something is secular, we're talking about it without reference to God. We're talking about it without reference to the supernatural. We're talking about worldly things. So that's what secular means. It's talking about things apart from God. When we talk about humanists, a modern humanist, in contrast to a classical humanist or a humanist of the Reformation or Renaissance, a modern humanist is a person who believes that human beings are the measure of all things. That human beings are the measure of all things. And so humanism would say that human beings are the ones who are value givers, that the human beings are the only ones really that can assign value to things. And some would justify it on one basis or another, but a secular humanist believes that A, there is no God, or that functionally or practically speaking, they don't adhere to a God, and B, that all things then, all questions of value must be judged in reference to humans, to their effect on humans, to the effect on, or to the consideration of humans and this sort of thing. So a secular humanist believes there's no God, so human beings are the only ones who can assign value to anything. There's nothing above us. There's no transcendent source of meaning or of value. All meaning, all value comes from human beings. That's what a secular humanist believes. In doing so, the humanist shows himself, or the secular humanist anyway, shows themselves to be atheistic or agnostic at the very least. Now, humanism or secular humanism is also existentialist. Now, the connection between them, now existentialism is the notion that we create ourselves through our choices. Among other things, we create ourselves through our choices. And the connection between secular humanism and existentialism is this, that human beings, when they're born into this world, have no value whatsoever because we have not created ourselves. However, throughout our lives, as we are given life and we continue in life, we begin to make choices. We define ourselves for who and what we are going to be. And so the secular humanist believes that existentialism really is the way that we find value. We create ourselves, we invest ourselves with value throughout the choices we make in life and so forth. All right, so we create ourselves. Individuals must create their own meaning in life. So the existentialist or the secular humanist would say there actually is no objective meaning to the world in which we live, to the life that we have, and the life that we live. There's no meaning to it. We have the ability to, however, through our choices, put meaning into our lives, and that meaning for me is found by me, and the meaning for you is found by you. There's no objective meaning, it's subjective. So there's no objective meaning in life. The meaning in life is entirely subjective. And your life has value to the extent that you give it value, to the extent that you value it. So do you value your life? If you do, then your life has value. However, if you don't value your life, then your life doesn't have value. You are the one who chooses that. It cannot be chosen for you. Now, this would mean necessarily that the meaning of life is not the same for everyone. I find meaning in things that I enjoy doing, in pursuits that I enjoy, in entertainment that I enjoy. You might do it quite differently than I do. Which is entirely fine in this, according to this scenario. We might ask, whose is better, yours or mine? Well, in order to say that my meaning is better than your meaning, or vice versa, your meaning is better than mine, we would have to have a standard, an objective standard by which both of us would be judged. And both of our lives would be judged. However, in secular humanism, you don't have an objective standard by which both of our lives are judged. Therefore, the meaning that you find for your life is your meaning. The meaning that I find for my life is mine. It's subjective, it's disconnected, and it will not be the same for everybody. Now, there are a couple of thinkers that we'll look at here. The first one is a philosopher by the name of Hazel Barnes. Hazel Barnes believes, she in her writings, she wrote that religion, and of course religion would be the source of objective meaning, right? She believes that religion is paternalistic. Religion is paternalistic. And what that means is that religion basically serves to help people who want to shield themselves with a layer of excuse for why they do what they do. And so it's kind of like a parent coming in and shielding their child, right? A parent that shelters their child. Well, Barnes believes that religion does that for people. That when we are faced with the necessity and the obligation to make choices in our lives, that we have to grasp onto religion in order to explain why we're going to choose the way that we do, to give us a proper motive for choosing how we want to choose. It serves as an excuse, right? We get to sort of not have to take full responsibility for our choices because we can always say, well, my religion teaches this, and so I'm just going to follow it, right? So she believes that religion is paternalistic, and she sees that as a bad thing. She believes that we ought to take responsibility for our own choices. You and I must accept responsibility to choose our own destiny. You need to create you as you see fit. I need to create me as I see fit. We must accept the responsibility to do that. Nobody can do it for us. And each person must find value in his or her own life, because that's where meaning comes from. Meaning doesn't come from the supernatural. Meaning doesn't come from religious sources. According to Barnes, meaning simply comes from as people find value in their own life. Now, Barnes is going to go on, and she's going to say, well, how do people find value in their life? Well, she's going to go on and suggest a few things. And this is where things maybe get a little interesting. We'll see why as we continue. But Barnes says that we can find satisfaction in our lives, for example, when we judge our life to have significance. When I, as the judge over my life, judge my life as having significance, then it has significance. So that's when I can find a meaning of life for myself. We also find satisfaction with our life when we find satisfaction when others judge our life as good. So we find satisfaction in our life when other people judge our life as good. So it's sort of like keeping up with the Joneses, right? So when you can make the Joneses look over to your yard and your stuff and your boat and whatever, you can make them, you look at your things and they're jealous of you, well, you can be satisfied in yourself when others find that you are admired and your life is good and other people are forming a consensus, man, I want to be like so-and-so. So when other people judge your life as good, you can find satisfaction in that. And we can also find satisfaction, she says, when we have helped make it easier for others to live in a way that is satisfying to them. We can find satisfaction when we help other people live in ways that are satisfying to them. So basically, it's all about personal, individual, subjective satisfaction. When you deem your life as satisfactory, then you're satisfied. When others view your life as good, then you can be satisfied that knowing you're kind of on the right track. And when you can help other people find satisfaction in their lives, then you can be satisfied. That's the notion behind secular humanism. Our satisfaction, that our meaning is to be found in the choices that we make, and we can interact with others and help them find their meaning, and we can derive meaning from what they think about us, and so on and so on, and as sort of social animals. Well, another thinker, actually just a quote that I'd like to read that kind of illustrates this notion of secular humanism is by a thinker whose name is Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens was a very popular atheist thinker in his day. He recently passed away just a couple of years ago, I think. But anyway, Hitchens was a brilliant guy. And he spoke to this issue of subjective morality. He embraced this subjectivism, this secular humanism. And here's what he says. He says, a life that partakes even a little of friendship, love, irony, humor, parenthood, literature, and music, in the chance to take part in battles for the liberation of others, cannot be called meaningless, except if the person living it is also an existentialist and elects to call it so. It could be that the existence is a pointless joke, but it is not, in fact, possible to live one's everyday life as if this were so. Now, that's an interesting admission. Hitchens does say that people should find meaning in things like love and joy and friendship and parenthood and these things. But then he goes on to say, it could be that life is a pointless joke. And what he's saying there, understand, is that it could be that life has no meaning whatsoever. It could be that there's no objective meaning to life. However, we can find meaning in our own individual lives, but here's the deal, he says, and he says it's not possible. It's not possible to live as if life is a joke. We don't live like that. Nobody lives like that. Everybody has meaning. Everybody finds value. Everybody has some sort of value or meaning in the life that they live. It's not possible to live like that. Secular humanism does run into a few problems, however, and there are at least a few questions that we want to look into as we evaluate this. For example, in secular humanism, human life has no meaning in certain contexts and at certain times. Human life has no meaning in various contexts. For example, when a child is born, and the child has not had an opportunity yet to make choices and create themselves, then their life has no meaning. Or when in elder years, if a person is incapacitated to some degree and can no longer function as a human being and may not even be conscious, their life has no meaning because they are not able to choose a life for themselves. And so they may have a little more meaning based on their past and that sort of thing. But life really ultimately has no meaning there either. And in certain contexts where if a person might suffer a certain illness that would incapacitate them to the point where it doesn't look like they'll recover, their life has no meaning at that point either. If they can't basically have value, then in certain contexts, human life has no meaning if they can't add value, if they can't value themselves. That's one significant issue. Another one is that there seems to be no moral standard or no ultimate moral standard from which to say a choice is good or bad. Now, this gets at some of the things that Barnes and Hitchens has talked about. If we go back to Barnes, she says that a life that is lived in an existentialist manner, that a life lived in such a way can find meaning. They can find satisfaction in valuing their own life. They can find satisfaction when other people value their life. They can find satisfaction whenever they help others live their lives in a way that values them. So, okay, that's all well and great, Ms. Barnes. But why is that the way that we can find meaning in life? I mean, that's certainly one thing that you've prescribed, but why not? What if I find value in demoralizing people? What if that's what really, what if that's what makes me tick? Devaluing other people. And you might say, well, that's terrible. Well, by what standard? By what standard? Existentialism doesn't offer a standard to say that demoralizing other people is bad. Or when Hitchens, when he talks about the idea that that a life that partakes in friendship and love and joy and irony and humor and parenthood and all these things, why must it find its satisfaction in those things? Why must we look for meaning in those things? For example, what if I like just going around and harming people? And so instead of friendship, I like creating enemies. Or instead of love, what about narcissism? Instead of parenthood, why not choose to go around and eliminate children? Why not violence? Why not selfishness? Why not these things? Why instead of their opposites? Because existentialism in the secular humanist worldview doesn't ever really give me a good moral reason why not. Now, it might say, for example, that those things are incompatible with human flourishing. I mean, if you go around creating enemies everywhere and you go around demoralizing people and you go around doing all these sorts of bad things, right? Violence and this kind of thing, then that's not going to lead to human flourishing. But then again, that begs the question. You're saying that human flourishing is good. By what standard is human flourishing good? Now, I understand that we might have a self-interest in human flourishing, but all that means is that human or that these things are practical toward human flourishing. Why is human flourishing a good thing? I mean, it keeps me alive longer, but at the end of the day, if there's no real objective meaning to life, then who cares? If I'm going to die and my memory is going to be lost and I'm going to fade into oblivion, then what does life really matter in the end anyway? So why does it matter if we promote human flourishing or human extinction? Why is the one better than the other? And the secular humanist worldview offers no moral basis whatsoever by which to say one choice is better than the other in a foundational, objective way. Again, remember, value is subjective. So it can't do that. However, the irony of this is that even though the secular humanist worldview does not have a basis for these things, for saying that there is an ultimate standard of moral value, nevertheless, they do it all the time. So there's really no way to avoid making absolute statements of value. Every time that you say something is good versus something is bad, you've made a statement of absolute value or an absolute statement of value. You have said, for example, human flourishing is good. Well, why is it good? That's a statement of objective value, something that is objectively true for everybody, and there's no way to avoid making those kinds of absolute statements and still having some sort of a moral or value integrity. So anyway, the secular humanist worldview, it seems to be a contradiction at that point. On the one hand, it has no basis for such a claim, and yet on the other hand, it makes those claims all the time. Think about Hazel Barnes. She was saying you find satisfaction when you say your life is good. Okay, so what? So why is satisfaction good? Why is satisfaction what I should look for or you should look for? What's the meaning, the purpose? What is the value of satisfaction? Sure, it helps me personally and subjectively, but at the end of the day, who cares about what? There's no meaning. There's no meaning in that. So anyway, so on the one hand, it has no basis for those values. On the other hand, it makes those assumptions all the time. So it seems to be contradicting itself or inconsistent at that point. So those are some issues with the secular humanist worldview. Now, that takes us to the third view that we're going to look at. So we've looked at nihilism. We've looked at secular humanism. The third view is the religious view. And the religious view basically says that we derive our meaning from God. God assigns us our meaning, that at some level every human being has the same meaning, right? And then it brings up a selection of reading by Tolstoy. And I want to talk about Tolstoy for a minute. However, I do want to preface it by saying that Tolstoy is actually a pretty bad example of the religious view. And I'll get to why that is in just a moment. But keep in mind that Tolstoy himself, in his writing, at least at this particular point, is not a very good example of the religious view as it's explained in the book and as we're going to explain it here as well. It's not a good example of it. But Tolstoy himself was a Russian intellectual. He was also an author. He also was nobility. He was a count. And so he has this sort of wonderful life, right? He's a count. He's independently wealthy. He can go about his day just pursuing his intellectual pursuits, and then he can write about it. And he does this for much of his life. In fact, he's 50 years old, and he has been dedicating his life to finding this pursuit of the meaning of life. And he believed that he could find it through intellectual endeavors, right? How to grow himself intellectually. And so he's a very learned guy. He's wealthy. He can do that. He can hire tutors and get educated, and he does all that. But he notices, you know what? Some of the most intellectual people that he knows are the most miserable, meaningless people in his life. And by meaningless, what I mean is they walk around as if life were meaningless. They look for meaning in certain pursuits, but at the end of the day, they have not found the meaning of life. They've not found that peace, that inner that ceasing of inner turmoil. And Tolstoy really has this crisis in his life. He's like, I want that peace, I want this, but I'm not finding it anywhere out, through either wealth or intellectual endeavors or sensual endeavors or anything like that. But what he notices is that the rational intellectuals of his day didn't have the meaning of life. But as he looked around, it seemed that the peasants did. Now, you got to think he's a count, right? And so he lives on this tract of land that is farmed by peasants who basically he's living off of their labor and basically sees that they eke out a meager existence for themselves. But they seem to be a lot happier. They seem to be a lot more content than the intellectuals that he's used to dealing with. So they have found the meaning of life. They have found this contentment, this joy, this inner peace, whereas all the intellectuals that he knows, all of them have not found it, have failed to find it. So eventually, what Tolstoy does is he seeks the meaning of life through faith in God, because he recognizes that the difference between the intellectuals that he is dealing with and the peasants that he is dealing with is the fact that the peasants had faith in God. And so Tolstoy does that, and he basically eventually finds faith in God and finds fulfillment through that faith. And the idea here is that if I can find fulfillment in this faith, if that is genuinely true, then that must mean that is the objective way that we need to find fulfillment. Because here we have peasants who, by all outward evidence, should not be enjoying life whatsoever, but they are. They're content. They're at peace. And we have intellectuals who are wealthy who should, by all outward appearances, be able to enjoy the very best that life has to offer, and they don't. They're miserable. The one distinction between them is that the peasants have God, whereas the intellectuals do not. And so Tolstoy believes that since this is basically ubiquitous, it's everywhere, then that must be the objective way in which human beings are meant to find the meaning in life. Okay, now I said earlier that Tolstoy is not a very good example of this, and here's why. Because afterwards, he's been rightly criticized. When people have said, well, wait a second, Tolstoy, you found faith in God, and through that faith you found meaning in God, but isn't this simply a way that you have found personal fulfillment? I mean, you're still a rich guy. Isn't this a way that you found personal fulfillment? And if that's the case, then really what you are is what might be called a Christian existentialist. You're a Christian existentialist. Maybe you're a theistic humanist. And basically this is what Soren Kierkegaard might have been. He was a Christian existentialist. Karl Barth later on, and others in the 20th century as well. Rudolf Bultmann. These are all Christian existentialists. And basically the idea here is that they find personal satisfaction in knowing God. And it's this religious experience is a subjective experience by which they they find meaning in life. And the critic would point out that there are many atheists who feel very fulfilled as well in their atheism. And so, Tolstoy clearly did not do a very big sample, right? He didn't conduct any sort of scientific statistical study to see the relative satisfaction levels between atheists and theists, and then correlate that with their income levels and all that stuff. He didn't do that sort of thing. He was just based off of anecdotal observations, and then reasoning in his own life, taking that leap in his own life and finding that fulfillment. That would have been a subjective thing. So, and I think the critics are right at this point. Tolstoy doesn't ever really say that his is that his is a universal thing, although he sort of hints at it. But I think it's a bad example of the religious view, because the religious view is actually objective, and the book talks about this, and it's quite correct. The religious view is objective. And so it's going to deal with value that is given to the human being by the one who has created those human beings. So the religious view actually starts out at this place. It starts out with the point that God is the creator of all things. Okay, so a religion that doesn't believe that God is the creator of all things is not one that falls into this category. So the religious view starts out that says God is the creator of all things. And God created each part of his world, including human beings, because human beings are part of God's world that he created. So God created each part of his world, including humans, with a purpose in mind. God had a purpose for them to fulfill. He had a purpose for granite rock. He had a purpose for sea salt. He had a purpose for the rings on Saturn, and he had a purpose for human beings. Now, we're not privy to what that purpose is regarding other things. However, for the purpose, the ultimate purpose for the individual human, the ultimate purpose is found within the purpose for what God created for all individuals. So God has created a human nature, a purpose for what it is to be human. In fact, and we'll talk about an example of this in just a moment, but God creates all human beings for a purpose, and as a race, as a species, for a purpose. And each individual within that species then has a way in which they individually fulfill that purpose. In those various different ways might look different. However, nonetheless, every one of those individual human beings is going to be fulfilling that ultimate purpose. So if the purpose is to love God, then one person might show their love to God by doing a really good job at building bridges. Another purpose might show their love for God by feeding orphans. Another purpose might show their love for God by creating a sanitation system for a town, and so on. Each individual has a way of showing love to God by doing these various things, if the purpose is to love God. And in each individual one might find their own individual way of doing it. But ultimately, the main purpose is the same, right? Meaning and purpose are objective because they come from God. They come from outside of us. My particular role that I choose within that might be subjective, but ultimately I should do anything that I do to pursue the ultimate purpose that God has intended for me. Now, to give you an example of this, I'm going to give an example from my own faith tradition of Christianity. Certainly, it would be different in various other traditions. In Christianity, God created all things, including humans, with a purpose. And the purpose in Christianity for human beings is to bear the image of God. The very first command that God gives is for human beings to go into the world and to take dominion over creation. And what that means is that they're to exercise a rulership over creation. They're to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the world and to bring order to the world. And in doing so, ultimately, the reason that they're doing so, the purpose for which they're doing this, is so that they can reflect the character and nature of God in the created order. So their ultimate purpose is to reflect the character and nature of God in creation. And the way in which they do that is that they be fruitful, they multiply, they fill the earth, they exercise dominion over it, they steward it, if you will. They act as stewards over all of creation. They have authority over it to order it and bring order to it in order to reflect God's image. So that's that. All of that is wrapped up in what it means to be a human being under the Christian understanding. Now, the problem comes in with Christianity in the narrative. The problem comes in when human beings rebel against God and they no longer they turn against this purpose, and they take it upon themselves to do whatever they want to do. And in doing so, then they're no longer pursuing the purpose for which God created them, and in doing so, they incur God's wrath. And that happens when Adam chooses to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He rebels against God. He starts pursuing his own plan and basically worshiping himself and his own ability to decide over God. God curses all of creation. And one might say, well, then how in the world are they going to be able to fulfill their purpose now? If their purpose is to show the character and nature of God in all of creation, how can they do it now that they have rebelled against God? Well, ultimately, they were created for this purpose, so they're going to do it. Now, this has nothing to do with finding personal peace and fulfillment. According to the Christian view, that's not in there. Now, you might very well find peace and fulfillment in the Christian faith, but ultimately, according to the Christian faith, that's not going to be the goal, or that's not going to be the end for everybody. It's going to be the end for some. But also, so what God does is He sends His own Son Jesus to the world, and Jesus takes the punishment that the rebels deserve. Right? He takes the punishment for what they've done wrong. And for all who trust in Jesus, they can be saved and they can be born again. They can go back and they can start fulfilling the purpose for which they were created. They can start exercising dominion in the world. They can start exhibiting the character and the nature of God in creation. But then there's those who will never believe. What happens to them? Well, according to the Christian faith, what happens to them is that they exhibit another side of God. You see, the born again folks, those people exhibit the mercy of God, the love of God, because God loved and God sent His Son and Jesus died. God sacrificed Himself for these people, and in doing so shows His mercy to them. But the people who continue in their rebellion against God, the people who choose not to believe in God, the people who don't have faith, according to the Christian view, those people are going to suffer the wrath of God forever. And God is going to send them to a place where they'll be punished by Him forever. And you might say to yourself, well, that doesn't sound very good. I mean, those people are not finding peace and fulfillment. Those people are suffering, right? So how does that exhibit, or how does that work within the whole plan of God? Well, here's the plan. Remember, the purpose of human beings was to show forth the character and nature of God in creation. Well, the people who are saved are going to do that, the people who are born again, but the people who are condemned are also going to do that. You might say, how so? Well, they're going to show forth the justice of God. They're going to show forth the judgment of God, the fact that He is one who is absolutely just. Because when they rebelled against Him, they also harmed other people in doing so. Because usually when we sin against God, we sin against other people as well, through lying or killing or stealing or one of those things. And so God exercises justice on those and shows mercy to the others. And in doing so, you've got one group whose job it is to show the mercy of God, the other group whose job it is to show the justice of God and the holiness of God, one who is absolutely perfect. So human beings are fulfilling their purpose, but they're doing it in various different ways. And that's how that sort of works. Either way, whether a person is condemned or whether a person is born again, they are fulfilling their ultimate purpose to display the character and nature of God. So that's ultimately how the religious view would work, and there's an objectivity to it. It isn't a subjective, oh, I feel better about myself. Oh, I feel at peace with the world. Oh, I feel fulfilled. I feel I feel enlightened or whatever. It has nothing to do with that. That's a subjective fulfillment, right? The objective fulfillment has to do with the ultimate purpose for which we're created. Are we created for justice? Are we created for mercy? Are we created for wrath? What is it? What are we created for? And that purpose is ultimately assigned by God. So that's the religious view. Now, the religious view would readily agree that, yes, some people will find subjective peace, subjective fulfillment. Some people will find that subjective satisfaction, as Barnes would talk about. But ultimately, objective value and objective meaning is not about personal satisfaction, if we're talking about something that is truly objective. Well, that's the religious view. And those are the three views: nihilism, secular humanism, and religion, the religious view. Now, two of the three, the latter two anyway, secular humanism and the religious view, might have different shades or variations within them. And there may be even some overlap. As I said before, there are also those who are known as religious existentialists. While they believe in God, they believe that God basically is there to serve their own personal fulfillment, their own needs, and their own desires, their own satisfaction. They believe that's the purpose for which God came, is to fulfill those things. So anyway, those are the various different views. And really the question is, in philosophy, what is the meaning in life? And that's something that each one of us has to wrestle with on our own. If the meaning is objective, we should certainly seek for it in that way. And in the meantime, find it also in various subjective pursuits as well. But yes, that's the meaning of life, the question of the meaning of life. Some things to think about, and within the parameters of those things to think about, it's good to examine, what is the meaning for my life? What does that mean for me? Well, this has been a great course, and I hope that you've gained quite a bit through it. Make sure that you check the syllabus again, to do all the work, take your quizzes or whatever else is there, and make sure that you get those done. And we will see you at the final exam. All righty, we'll see you then.